Hey guys, tonight we step into a world where the streets are cobbled. Torches flicker against thick stone walls, and you can almost hear the clang of blacksmiths shaping iron in the distance. Imagine yourself wandering through a medieval town. Square you're wrapped in a cloak that scratches just a little too much, and the smell of roasted meat mixes oddly with, well, let's just say hygiene wasn't winning awards back then. You probably won't survive this era unless you're really into drafty castles and questionable water quality. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is. Drop that in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You've heard it before. Medieval castles were nothing but piles of rock primitive forts where kings shivered while waiting for some invading army to knock on the door. That's the myth, isn't it? That castles were crude, dark, drafty lumps of stone thrown together by sweaty peasants who just guessed where the walls should go. You picture a big gray block, no elegance, no finessed, just medieval Lego bricks stacked high enough to keep the bad guys out. But here's the flip. Castles weren't just big walls of rock. They were deliberate, calculated, and, dare I say, almost sneaky. Every curve, every slit, every winding staircase had a purpose. They weren't primitive at all. They were clever defense machines, disguised as houses of power. Take the arrow slits, those thin vertical windows you've probably seen in old ruins. They weren't just random design choices. They were crafted so defenders could fire arrows out at attackers while being almost invisible from the outside. If you tried to shoot an arrow back through that tiny gap, good luck. You'd need the aim of a gamer who's been grinding in first-person shooters since 2003. Mainstream historical fact. The concentric castle design. That's when builders made not one wall, but multiple layers of walls, like an onion with teeth. Even if an enemy breached the first wall, they'd face another, taller, stronger one. It was the medieval version of you thought you beat level 1, but wait until you see the boss battle. Quirky tidbit. Some castles had what you could call medieval airbags. In Caerphilly Castle in Wales, the moat wasn't just water for defense. It was engineered to deliberately flood certain areas if enemies tried digging tunnels underneath. Imagine being a would-be invader covered in mud, only to find your tunnel turning into a swimming pool. Not exactly the glory moment you pictured. And here's a scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether spiral staircases in castles twisted clockwise purely for defense. The theory goes like this. Most soldiers were right-handed, so as they rushed up the stairs, their sword arms were cramped against the central column, giving the defender the upper hand. Was it intentional genius, or just a happy architectural accident? That one's still up for discussion. Of course, castles weren't flawless. Siege engines, like trebuchets, could hurl boulders big enough to make even the strongest wall sweat. But castles were never just about the walls. They were about psychology. Standing tall on a hill, glistening in the morning fog, they told enemies, yeah, you can try, but we'll still be here long after your lunch goes cold. And here's your punchline. Castles may have been built for war, but inside, people still argued over who left their muddy boots by the hearth, because no matter how advanced your fortress is, you can't engineer away family drama. You picture it, don't you? A bunch of burly men in tunics hauling massive stones up wooden ramps, shouting, sweating, and basically depending on sheer brute force to build those jaw-dropping cathedrals. The myth goes like this: medieval builders just threw muscle at the problem until walls were tall and arches didn't fall. No brains, just brawn. Like a gym session gone on for centuries. But here's the twist: cathedrals didn't just rise on sweat. They rose on math. Invisible geometry whispered into stone. Numbers etched into every angle. Calculations baked into each soaring arch. These weren't monuments to biceps. They were monuments to brains. Picture Notre Dame in Paris. It isn't just a big hunk of rockets, a 200-foot-tall physics experiment. Those ribbed vaults, those delicate pointed arches, they're not decorations, they're structural hacks. The pointed arch distributed weight better than the round Roman ones before it, channeling pressure downward instead of outward. Translation: you could build higher without the whole thing pancaking like a badly stacked Jenga tower. Mainstream. Historical fact: flying buttresses. You've seen them, the spindly arms hugging the outside of cathedrals. They weren't decorative wings. They were external skeletons, pulling weight off the walls and transferring it away. Without them, stained glass windows would have shattered, walls would have collapsed, and those heavenly heights, forget it. Now, for the quirky tidbit: some masons carved secret doodles and jokes into stones, high up where no one could see. Little monsters, faces, even crude cartoons. Imagine spending your life doing precise geometry and sneaking in a medieval meme halfway up a spire. You're basically the guy who draws doodles in math class, but accidentally creates part of Europe's most iconic architecture. And here's the scholarly debate: did master masons truly understand all the mathematics they used, or were they simply following traditional patterns passed down by guilds? Some argue they knew advanced geometry equivalent to modern trigonometry. Others say they just repeated rituals, like following grandma's secret recipe, without really knowing why it worked. Historians still bicker over whether they were geniuses, with compasses or lucky copycats. But make no mistake, those cathedrals stand because of precision. Workers laid out entire floor designs with ropes and chalk, mapping out proportions like giant blueprints on the ground. Then, stone by stone, they lifted geometry into the sky. And somehow, against every odd, it all held. Sure, accidents happened. A vault could collapse mid-construction, crushing months of work in seconds. But when they got it right, the results made people's jaws drop. Imagine walking inside a Gothic cathedral for the first time back then. Colored light pouring through. Glass arches stretching upward, like hands reaching for heaven. It wasn't just a building. It was a sermon in stone. And here's your punchline: the next time you balance a wobbly IKEA shelf, just remember 800 years ago, a guy with a rope and some chalk casually built something that still stands taller than your Wi-Fi router. So here's the picture most people carry: medieval builders stumbling around with hammers and saws, more concerned with not dropping a stone on their foot than with any fancy geometry. The myth says they couldn't even spell math, let alone use it. Geometry, trigonometry, angles. Nah, they were just winging it, right? But here's the flip. You'd be shocked how much geometry shaped the medieval world. Builders weren't just stacking stones. They were running mental math marathons, often without even realizing it. They didn't need a chalkboard full of formulas. They had ropes, compasses, and an instinct for ratios that would make your high school math teacher sweat with envy. Take the humble rope, tie knots at equal intervals, and suddenly it becomes a portable calculator. Stretch it out, peg it in a triangle, and congratulations, you've just recreated the Pythagorean theorem without ever opening a textbook. Medieval masons did this daily, laying out walls, windows, and arches with a precision modern engineers would respect. Mainstream historical fact. Builders relied heavily on ad quadratum and ad triangulum design systems based on squares and equilateral triangles. Cathedrals like Chartres were designed using these geometric grids, ensuring harmony and stability. It wasn't luck that those windows lined up perfectly, it was math, baby. Now for a quirky tidbit, some cathedral floors literally doubled as geometry lessons. At Amiens Cathedral, you can trace labyrinth patterns built into the floor giant. Puzzles of proportion. Pilgrims thought they were spiritual mazes. Masons knew they were flexing their geometry muscles in stone. Here's the scholarly debate. Did medieval masons inherit this math from Roman sources, Islamic scholars, or pure trial and error? Some argue they studied translations of Euclid passed through the Islamic Golden Age. Others claim it was grassroots knowledge born out of hands-on trial and sheer stubbornness. Historians still argue whether medieval builders were secretly educated or just ridiculously clever. Imagine you're a mason up on scaffolding, chalk in hand, trying to figure out how to get to arches to meet perfectly. You swing your compass like a wizard's wand, mark out curves in the air, and boom, mathematics becomes architecture. Sure, no calculators, no laptops, but plenty of sleeping trigonometry waking up in each stroke of chalk. And of course, mistakes happened. Misjudge your ratio and the wall could bulge or buckle. One wrong line and you're not building a cathedral, you're building an expensive pile of rubble. But when the geometry clicked, it was like music in stone. Balanced, resonant, eternal. Here's your punchline. The next time you panic over calculating a tip at dinner, remember 8 centuries ago, a mason was casually plotting geometry so tight it's still standing while your algebra notebook is probably long gone. So the myth goes like this. Medieval wooden roofs were disasters waiting to happen. You imagine heavy beams groaning, sagging, creaking with every gust of wind until crash, the whole thing comes down like a badly built treehouse. The stereotype is clear. Stone was strong, wood was weak, and medieval carpenters were basically just whittling in the dark. But here's the flip. Those wooden roofs, they were marvels of carpentry, engineered with tricks so smart they'd give modern architects pause. In fact, many medieval timber roofs are still standing tall after centuries, straighter than your posture after 3 hours on TikTok. Let's start with the hammerbeam roof. Picture a vast wooden skeleton overhead, beams branching like ribs across a cathedral ceiling, instead of one giant sag-prone beam spanning the whole width. Carpenters cleverly broke the structure into smaller sections, each distributing the weight outward and downward. The result? Lighter, stronger, and much less saggy. Mainstream historical fact. Westminster Hall, in London, completed in 1399, still boasts the largest surviving medieval timber roof in England. It's a hammerbeam masterpiece, no sagging, no drooping, just a ceiling so sturdy it's hosted everything from royal banquets to political debates. That's nearly 700 years of service without a squeak. Quirky tidbit. Some roofs were built with deliberately curved beams, known as cruck frames. Carpenters sometimes shaped them from naturally bent oak trees, picking trunks that had grown in just the right arc. It's like they were tree whisperers, letting nature do half the engineering. Talk about recycling. Those guys made eco-friendly design cool before it was trending. And here's the scholarly debate. Were medieval carpenters working from mathematical plans or from generations of experience passed down like folk songs? Some argue they used precise geometric ratios. Others think they relied more on feel-hands-on craft, honed by instinct. Historians still scratch their heads about whether it was genius calculation or inherited know-how. The truth is, timber wasn't the weak link at all. Builders knew how to prevent warping by seasoning wood properly, cutting joints that locked like puzzles, and distributing loads so cleverly that the roof almost floated. Step into a medieval hall today, look up, and you'll see not chaos, but harmony in beams and braces. Of course, roofs still needed upkeep. Neglect the beams, let damp creep in, and yes, rot would win. But when cared for, these structures aged better than most of us after a stressful week. And here's your punchline. The next time your flat-packed bookshelf leans like it's had one too many, remember 700 years ago, a carpenter shaped an oak beam that still holds straighter than your latest online order. So here's the popular picture. Moats were nothing more than muddy trenches filled with questionable water and maybe a few unlucky frogs. People imagine them as glorified puddles, dug just to slow down charging knights or give alligators a place to live in Hollywood movies. Basically, dirty medieval swimming pools. But here's the flip. Moats were way more than ditches. They were multitasking marvels, serving not just as defense systems, but as get the surly air conditioning and plumbing hacks. In other words, they doubled as medieval HVAC. Yep, you've been underestimating those muddy ditches your whole life. First, the defense angle was obvious. Fill it with water and suddenly siege towers couldn't roll up to your walls. Sappers couldn't tunnel easily, and any poor soul who fell in would be slogging through muck with arrows raining down. Not exactly a power move, but here's the cool part. Moats also helped regulate temperature. At certain castles, the water absorbed heat during the day and cooled the air that circulated inside. Picture it while you're sweating through summer. A medieval lord is lounging in his hall, cooled by the moat outside like he's got the 14th century version of Central AC, mainstream historical fact, at the Château de Chambord in France. Moats and water systems weren't just decorative, they were integrated into the overall design to keep interiors comfortable. This wasn't just mud and mosquitoes, it was climate engineering. Quirky tidbit. Some moats were stocked with fish. Imagine grabbing dinner straight from your defensive ditch. Talk about convenience. You defend your castle and catch a snack at the same time. 2 birds, 1 moat. Now for the scholarly debate. Were all moats deliberately engineered for climate and sanitation, Or did some just happen to offer those benefits by chance? Some historians argue the airflockling effect was intentional. Others think lords just got lucky with side effects. The jury's still out, though the evidence leans toward intentional design. And don't forget sanitation. Moats often acted as waste channels, flushing away sewage. Not glamorous, but practical. Of course, this made moat water smell like a medieval dumpster fire. So no, you wouldn't want to swim in it, despite what cartoons suggest. But all in all, moats weren't useless ditches. They were multifunctional lifelines, defense systems, climate control, food sources, and sanitation solutions rolled into one. Honestly, they put most modern smart homes to shame. Here's your punchline. The next time your AC breaks in July, just remember you could always dig a giant trench around your house, fill it with carp, and call it medieval innovation. So, let's set the scene. You stroll through a medieval cathedral, craning your neck at those tall, pointed arches. They look delicate, almost ornamental, like someone just thought, hey, let's make stone prettier. The myth says those arches were purely for decoration, a kind of medieval fashion statement in architecture, pointy for the sake of being pointy. But here's the flip. Those Gothic arches weren't just eye candy. They were architectural hacks, load-bearing, weight-distributing marvels that made skyscraper-like heights possible centuries before steel frames and cranes. Think of them less as fancy design and more as the medieval engineer's cheat code. Here's how it works. Unlike the older Roman round arch, which pushes weight sideways, the pointed Gothic arch channels it down and out. The sharper the point, the more effectively the weight travels into the supporting columns. Translation: walls could be taller, windows could be bigger, and buildings could reach toward heaven without collapsing into rubble. Mainstream historical fact: Chartres Cathedral in France stands today largely because of its Gothic arches and flying buttresses. Without those structural innovations, its massive stained glass windows would have shattered long ago, and its spire would have remained a dream. Quirky tidbit: some Gothic arches were so thin and airy that locals believed angels held them up. Seriously, medieval churchgoers whispered that divine hands kept those arches standing because human hands couldn't possibly build something so weightless. It was less science class and more miracle on Stone Street. And here's the scholarly debate. Did Gothic builders invent the pointed arch on their own, or did they borrow it from Islamic architecture, where it had been in use earlier? Some argue for independent development. Others say cultural exchange. During the Crusades carried the idea back to Europe. Historians still tussle over which side gets bragging rights. But one thing's clear: those arches were never just pretty shapes. They were the backbone of medieval skyscrapers, each curve whispering, "Physics is on my side." Without them, no Notre Dame, no Reims, no soaring cathedrals that still awe tourists today. And let's be honest, without pointed arches, Gothic architecture would look like a Romanesque cosplay party. Heavy, squat, dark. Instead, we got light, verticality, and a skyline that literally lifted people's eyes to heaven. Here's your punchline. So the next time you walk under a modern skyscraper and think, wow, that's tall, remember your medieval ancestors already cracked the code, only they did it with chisels, ropes, and prayer, not steel beams and spreadsheets. So here's the myth. Medieval masons just eyeballed it. You picture a guy with a beard, holding a rock in one hand and shrugging like a looks straight enough. The idea is that castles, cathedrals, and bridges were basically freestyle projects, more guesswork than planning, more hope than engineering. But here's the flip. Medieval masons didn't just wing it. They had a toolkit of secret gadgets and measuring tricks that went way beyond good eyesight. These weren't clumsy guessers. They were precision workers with instruments that look simple today but carried centuries of genius. Take the mason's square. Not just any square, but a tool crafted to check perfect right angles on stone blocks. Pair it with a compass, and suddenly you're laying out circles, arcs, and proportions as exact as any blueprint. And don't forget the humble plumblina string with a weight at the end that could reveal vertical alignment more reliably than your phone's level app. Mainstream historical fact: masons used tracery yards, giant wooden templates, to pre-measure and carve intricate window patterns. Instead of climbing 50 feet up and hoping for the best, they laid out stone tracery on the ground, assembled it like a puzzle, then hoisted it into place. No eyeballing, just methodical planning. Quirky tidbit: some masons carved secret measuring marks into stones that only insiders could read. To you, it might look like a random scratch. To them, it was a built-in instruction manual, like leaving Easter eggs in the walls. These marks were also used for wages. One mason's symbol told the boss which pieces he'd carved, ensuring payday accuracy. Medieval punch cards, basically. And here's the scholarly debate. Were these tools universal, or did each guild develop its own secret geometry? Some argue guilds fiercely protected their knowledge, passing instruments and methods only to sworn apprentices. Others believe tools and tricks spread freely across Europe. Historians still debate whether it was a closed club of knowledge or an open-source community long before GitHub. Now, picture yourself standing on scaffolding 100 feet above the ground, holding a plumb line swaying in the breeze. The whole cathedral depends on you getting this wall vertical. No pressure, right? Except, yes, all the pressure. And yet, with these gadgets, masons pulled it off, stone after stone, century after century. Of course, mistakes happened. Tilt a wall too much, and the result wasn't wholly grandeur, it was wholly rubble. But when tools and skill aligned, the effect was breathtaking. Here's your punchline. The next time you hang a crooked picture frame and blame your eyesight, just remember it. 100 years ago, a guy with a string and a rock was building landmarks that still outlast your wall hooks. So here's the myth. Castles were nothing more than drafty, miserable caves for kings in pointy hats. You imagine damp stone corridors, freezing halls, and everyone coughing from the cold, while torchlight flickered gloomily. Basically, the medieval Airbnb from Helleminides include frostbite, mildew, and the faint smell of wet dog. But here's the flip. Castles weren't as dark and depressing as you've been told. Sure, they didn't have central heating or LED bulbs, but builders had a bag of tricks for light, warmth, and airflow that made these places surprisingly livable, sometimes even cozy. First up, windows. Not giant gaping holes, but carefully angled slits and embrasures that let daylight flood in while keeping enemies out. The wider inside angles funneled sunlight deeper into rooms, so interiors weren't pitch black. Imagine sunlight sliding across carved stone, bouncing off tapestries, and warming the hall. Then there's heating. No, castles weren't toasty, like your thermostat-controlled apartment, but fireplaces and chimneys made a world of difference. Builders lined walls with flues vertical channels that carried warm air upward and spread heat into upper chambers. It wasn't perfect, but compared to shivering in a hut, it felt like first class. Mainstream historical fact: Dover Castle in England had sophisticated ventilation shafts that carried smoke away and fresh air in. Some halls were engineered to draw in breezes during summer, cooling the space like an early climate system. Quirky tidbit: some castles even had heated toilets. Yes, really. Stone garderobes built into the outer walls, sometimes aligned with warm flues. So when you sat down, the seat was pre-warmed. Forget heated seats in your car. Medieval lords were already testing luxury plumbing. And here's the scholarly debate: were these designs common across castles, or just luxuries of the richest ones? Some historians say every serious fortress had heating and airflow tricks. Others argue it was rare, reserved for kings and bishops. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. But one thing's certain: not every castle was a damp cave. And don't forget about decor. Tapestries weren't just pretty, they were insulation. Huge woven fabrics hung on stone walls, trapping heat, blocking drafts, and adding bursts of color. Walk into a great hall draped in bright textiles and bathed in filtered light, and suddenly it feels less like a cave and more like a palace. Of course, it wasn't perfect. Winters could still be brutal, and drafty corners were real. But castles weren't as gloomy as TV dramas suggest. Builders engineered comfort with the tools they had, and, honestly, they did a better job than most people expect. Here's your punchline: the next time your apartment feels chilly because the landlord won't fix the heat, just remember, medieval noble was chilling in a semi-heated toilet, wrapped in tapestries, bragging about his sunlight angles. So, here's the myth: drawbridges were nothing more than heavy wooden planks slapped across a moat. You picture a couple of guards grunting and pulling on ropes, maybe a crank or two, and the whole thing creaking up like a garage door on its last legs. Primitive, clumsy, slow. But here's the flip: drawbridges weren't dumb slabs of wood. They were marvels of medieval mechanics, balanced with counterweights, gears, and clever systems that made them rise and fall smoothly, like early machines of war and peace. In short, they were less rickety plank and more transformer in oak and iron. Picture a castle gate. The drawbridge is down. Merchants roll their carts across. Guards lean on spears. Suddenly, a lookout spots riders on the horizon. Within moments, the guards crank a winch, and thanks to pulleys and counterweights, the heavy bridge lifts like it weighs nothing. Attackers arrive to find not an open door, but a vertical wall of timber armored with iron plates. Surprise, you're not invited. Mainstream historical fact: many drawbridges used massive stone counterweights hidden in the gatehouse. These weights balanced the bridge so perfectly that a handful of men could raise tons of wood and iron in minutes. It wasn't brute force, it was physics in action. Quirky tidbit: some bridges weren't just pulled up, they were actually slid into place using grooves and tracks. Others had sneaky falling bridges that could drop suddenly, sending unsuspecting enemies tumbling into the moat below. Think medieval slapstick with real consequences. And here's the scholarly debate. Were drawbridges primarily meant for daily convenience, letting merchants in and out, or were they mainly psychological weapons to intimidate attackers? Some historians say they were practical, functioning like a modern driveway gate. Others argue they were symbols of authority, reminding everyone outside that access was a privilege controlled by the Lord. The truth, probably both, but there's no denying the brilliance. Drawbridges turned castles into living machines, dynamic defenses that could change in seconds. And the mechanical principles behind them, pulleys, gears, levers, are the same ones you'd find in any modern garage door or lift system. Medieval engineers weren't just building, they were prototyping technology we still use today. Of course, things didn't always go smoothly. Ropes snapped, bridges jammed, and sometimes you'd get the medieval equivalent of being locked out of your own house. Not exactly the heroic moment knights dreamed of. Here's your punchline. So the next time your automatic gate refuses to open and you curse modern tech, remember it. Centuries ago, some castle guard was probably saying, "Sorry, boss, the bridge is stuck again." So here's the myth. Stained glass was nothing but medieval eye candy. You imagine pretty colors, saints with halos, sunlight turning into rainbows, and peasants gawking at the spectacle. Myth says it was all just for decoration art, with no brain behind it. But here's the flip. Stained glass wasn't only spiritual wallpaper. It was science in action, careful chemistry, controlled light, even heat management. Those dazzling windows weren't just storytelling tools. They were the medieval equivalent of high-tech optics, turning cathedrals into laboratories of color and light. Let's start with the basics. To make stained glass, craftsmen mixed sand with ash, then added metallic oxides for color, copper for greens, cobalt for blues, gold for deep reds. They melted it all into sheets, cut it into shapes, and soldered it with lead. But here's the kicker. The thickness of the glass and the choice of metals affected how much light and heat passed through. Cathedrals were, in a sense, experimenting with solar control long before tinted car windows. Mainstream historical fact: Chartres cathedrals, famous blue glass Chartres blues, legendary not just for its beauty, but for its stability. That shade has resisted fading for centuries, outlasting most modern dyes. Quirky tidbit. Medieval stained glass sometimes contained tiny air bubbles or streaks, which actually refracted light more beautifully. Visitors thought it was heavenly shimmer. Really, it was just glorious imperfections. Builders knew these quirks made light dance across stone walls like living fire. Imagine calling your manufacturing flaws holy sparkle and getting away with it. And here's the scholarly debate. Did stained glass windows function deliberately as climate control, filtering sunlight and reducing interior heat? Or was that just a happy side effect? Some argue the craftsmen knew exactly what they were doing, using dark tones to cool interiors. Others think they were focused on theology and beauty, with comfort as a bonus. Historians still argue whether cathedrals were early or just pretty lucky. But beyond science, stained glass worked on psychology. Step into a dim cathedral, watch colored light pour across the floor, and suddenly the space doesn't just look divine, it feels divine. For medieval people, who lived mostly in drab wooden huts, the effect was like stepping into another universe. Of course, not every pane was flawless. Windows cracked, lead melted, repairs mismatched. Sometimes saints ended up with new noses or swapped colors after hasty fixes. Imagine St. Peter suddenly rocking neon green because that's the only glass available that year. Here's your punchline. The next time your sunglasses fog up and you curse them, just remember 800 years ago, glassmakers were casually turning sand and fire into glowing, heat-filtering rainbow panels that still outshine your tinted car windows. So here's the myth. Every leaning medieval tower is basically a mistake. The Leaning Tower of Pisa becomes the punchline. Medieval builders didn't know how to pour a flat foundation. Oops. But here's the flip. Leaning towers weren't always accidents. Sometimes the tilt was unplanned, yes, but other times it was deliberate, structural, or even symbolic choice. Not every medieval lean was an oops. Some were a gotcha. Take Pisa. Sure, the famous tilt began because of weak soil. But instead of giving up, builders adapted. Over successive stages, they adjusted the constructions, slightly curving the upper levels to counteract the lean. The result? That's not failure, it's improvisation that worked. Mainstream historical fact. Several medieval bell towers across Europe were built with intentional slants, not because builders were bad at geometry, but because they wanted to increase visibility from afar. A leaning profile stood out against the skyline, guiding pilgrims like a medieval billboard. Quirky tidbit. In Bologna, Italy, two medieval towers, the Asinelli and the Garisenda, both lean locales, nicknamed them the Two Sisters, and poets wrote about their tilt as if the towers were bowing in greeting. What started as a flaw became folklore, and the city embraced the lean as identity. And here's the scholarly debate. Were these adjustments conscious engineering or just desperate patch jobs? Some historians argue masons intentionally bent structures for stability. Others insist they were scrambling to save face, not innovating. The truth is probably both. Some leans were accidents that genius masons turned into style. But here's what's undeniable. The lean became a feature, not a bug. People flocked to see it, towns celebrated it, and the towers survived. What was once a mistake turned into an architectural signature. And, honestly, medieval people weren't dumb. If a tower was about to collapse, they didn't just shrug and say, well, let's see what happens. They reinforced, they rebalanced, they adjusted. These weren't sloppy mistakes, they were lessons written in stone. Here's your punchline. So the next time your bookshelf tilts and you call it a disaster, just slap a tourist sign on it. Congrats, you've built the next Pisa. So here's the myth. Every cathedral, every castle, every bridge was built entirely by peasants sweating with bare hands. You imagine armies of laborers hauling stone blocks up ramps, groaning under impossible weights, while nobles shouted, "Work faster." The picture is pure, back-breaking manual labor. No machines, no help, just calloused hands and sheer misery. But here's the flip. Medieval builders had machines. Not machines with engines or electricity, but brilliant contraptions powered by gravity, wood, ropened sometimes, by people walking inside giant hamster wheels. Yes, hamster wheels. Except the hamsters were full-grown men. Let's start with cranes. Medieval treadwheel cranes were massive wooden wheels, sometimes 15 feet wide, with workers walking inside like human-sized gerbils. Their weight turned gears that lifted stones weighing tons. What looks like a medieval torture device was actually efficient engineering. These cranes could hoist cathedral spires into the sky, stone by stone, with surprising speed. Mainstream historical fact: treadwheel cranes were common on building sites by the 13th century. In fact, some were left permanently inside towers to assist with maintenance for centuries after construction ended. At Cologne Cathedral, a medieval crane sat on the unfinished tower for over 400 years, basically the world's longest-standing construction project. Quirky tidbit: sometimes animals joined in. Donkeys and oxen were hitched to capstans rotating wooden drums, wound with rope to haul blocks upward. Picture a stubborn donkey powering one of the greatest cathedrals of Europe. Forget divine inspirations. Sometimes the miracle was 4 legs and a carrot. And here's the scholarly debate: did these machines significantly speed up construction? Or were they just minor assists while the bulk of work still depended on muscle? Some historians argue the machines revolutionized building, while others insist laborers still carried the heaviest load. The truth probably lies in between. Machines eased the hardest tasks, but human sweat still fueled progress. But make no mistake, medieval sites were buzzing with mechanical innovation. Hoists, pulleys, windlasses, and block and tackle systems were everywhere. Builders weren't just brute workers, they were engineers, tinkering constantly with ways to make stone float skyward. And sure, accidents happened. A snapped rope could send a block crashing down like a medieval meteorite, being the guy inside the hamster wheel when that happened. Yeah, not a job with great benefits. Here's your punchline. So the next time you complain about carrying grocery bags up the stairs, just remember your ancestors were basically running marathons inside giant wheels to lift cathedrals, one stone at a time. So here's the myth: only kings, bishops, and rich lords had access to building secrets. You picture peasants stuck in mud huts, while elites guarded architectural know-how like it was the medieval version of a Netflix password. The story goes, nobles built castles, peasants built shacks, period. But here's the flip: ordinary villagers weren't clueless. They had their own hacks, clever construction tricks, passed down generation to generation, that helped them survive in drafty climates and unstable soils. While cathedrals soared in stone, peasants quietly mastered timber, mud, and straw, creating homes that were smarter than they looked. Take wattle and daub walls. Villagers wove flexible sticks, the wattle into a lattice, then smeared it with a mix of mud, straw, and sometimes even animal dung, the daub. It sounds gross, but it created strong, insulated walls that held up for decades. It was basically medieval eco-brickwork, and bonus, renewable, cheap, and fire-resistant when plastered. Mainstream historical fact: half-timbered houses like the ones still standing in German towns were built by ordinary folk. The wooden frame provided stability, and the infill materials varied depending on what was locally available. They weren't just huts, they were modular, adaptable designs that kept communities alive. Quirky tidbit: peasants sometimes hid coins, shoes, or even dead cats inside the walls of their houses. Why? They believed these magic charms would protect against evil spirits. Imagine calling pest control only to find your ancestor purposely bricked in a tabby as a medieval home security system. And here's the scholarly debate. How much of peasant building knowledge came from official guild techniques versus independent village experimentation? Some argue guild secrets trickled down. Others believe villagers developed their own parallel systems entirely. The answer's murky, but either way, peasants weren't clueless copycats. They were innovators in their own right. They also hacked insulation. Thatched roofs weren't just cheap, they trapped heat like natural insulation, and their steep slopes shed rain with surprising efficiency. Meanwhile, clay floors absorbed warmth from hearth fires, acting like primitive underfloor heating. No nobles required. Sure, peasant homes lacked the grandeur of castles. They were smoky, cramped, and often shared with animals. But they were smart, tailored to climate, terrain, and survival needs. For people without architects, the ingenuity was astonishing. Here's your punchline, so the next time you complain about your drafty apartment, just picture a medieval farmer saying, "Oh, don't worry, stuffed my walls with cow poop, works great." So here's the myth. Medieval builders were stuck in tradition, terrified of change. You picture them clutching dusty scrolls, muttering, "This is how my master did it, so this is how I'll do it too." The story paints them as cautious copycats, afraid to experiment, allergic to risk. In this version of history, innovation only wakes up in the Renaissance, while the Middle Ages snooze in 1,000 years of architectural reruns. But here's the flip. Medieval builders were bold experimenters. They tried, they failed, they tweaked. They risked collapse and, often, they succeeded in ways that still baffle us. Far from fearing innovation, they embraced it. Cathedrals, castles, and bridges were giant laboratories in stone and wood. Every arch was a test, every spire a gamble. If you've ever thought engineers today are daring, just imagine being a mason balancing 200 feet up, carving a new design into existence without even a calculator. Start with cathedrals. Early Gothic architects pushed boundaries constantly. Taller vaults, thinner walls, wider windows. They weren't playing it safe. Notre Dame in Paris stretched arches to new limits. Beauvais Cathedral went even further, building the tallest vaults in Europe. Did they collapse? Yep. Did that stop builders? Nope. They rebuilt, reinforced, and kept experimenting, determined to touch heaven with stone. Mainstream historical fact. Medieval bridges were another arena of innovation. London Bridge, built in the 12th century, was a marvel of engineering, complete with houses, shops, and even a chapel sitting atop its arches. It wasn't just a bridge, it was a floating neighborhood. To pull that off, masons had to innovate, constantly experimenting with foundation techniques in rushing water that would challenge even modern crews. Now, for a quirky tidbit, medieval builders sometimes invented solutions by accident. True or not, there's evidence of organic additives like blood, milk, or even beer being tossed into mixtures. And here's the scholarly debate. Some historians argue medieval builders deeply understood physics and geometry, carefully planning every change. Others say they simply improvised, fixing problems as they appeared. Innovation also meant tools. By the 13th century, builders were experimenting with new hoisting machines. They weren't passive, they were restless tinkerers. And let's not forget aesthetics. Gothic spires, twisted columns, elaborate vault ribs. None of these were safe choices. Each was a risk. Would the weight hold? Would the stone crack? Would the townspeople even like it? Yet time and again they tried. Some projects failed spectacularly, but many left us with wonders still standing tall today. You're a villager watching a new tower rise higher than any building you've ever seen. Each day you wonder, will it hold, or will it come crashing down? And then one morning, sunlight catches the new spire, golden against the sky, and you realize you've just watched innovation change your skyline forever. Of course, not every risk paid off. Beauvais Cathedral remains partly ruined, a reminder that ambition sometimes outpaces physics. But failure didn't prove fear, it proved courage. Builders weren't afraid to push limits. They just accepted that collapse was part of the process. Across continents, medieval timber roofs, for instance, are still stronger and more efficient than many 19th-century industrial roofs. Some aqueduct systems functioned for centuries with minimal repairs. Even now, engineers scratch their heads at how perfectly balanced some medieval domes remain. So no, medieval builders didn't fear innovation. They flirted with disaster to create beauty and strength in stone. And here's your punchline. The next time you're too nervous to try a new recipe because you might burn dinner, remember your ancestors risked collapsing an entire cathedral just to see if their new idea might work. So here's the myth. Medieval building tricks are long gone. You imagine a sharp divide back then, stone and wood. Now, steel and glass. The story goes that modern engineering replaced everything medieval, tossing their quirky methods into the dustbin of history. But here's the flip. Medieval tricks didn't vanish. You're living among their ideas right now, without even realizing it. Take pointed arches. Sure, they look medieval, but their principle distributing weight more efficiently still underpins modern skyscraper design. Steel beams may have replaced stone, but the math of stress and load remains the same. Your office tower owes its shape to a mason's chalk line scratched on a cathedral floor centuries ago. Think of the Eiffel Tower or modern stadiums with visible skeletons. The logic is identical: pull weight outward, free up interior space. You can thank medieval masons for inventing open-plan architecture centuries before Silicon Valley thought it was trendy. Quirky tidbit. Wattle and daub mud. Walls reinforced with stick seams, primitive, yet the same principle survives in eco-building today. Modern cob houses and earth plaster designs echo medieval peasants' survival hacks. Knowledge flow continuously into modern architecture, or was it rediscovered during the Renaissance and Enlightenment? Some argue there's a straight line from Gothic masons to today's engineers. Others insist the chain broke and had to be ripped. Either way, the DNA of medieval innovation runs through modern skylines. Think about bridges, segmental arches. First refined in medieval Europe, became the backbone of Renaissance and later construction. Even today, concrete bridges mimic the same curvature, those sweeping spans across highways. Medieval masons would recognize the math instantly, and heating. Flues and chimneys in your house trace back to castles. Ventilation shafts in modern skyscrapers echo medieval castle designs for airflow. Even your bathroom fan has roots in garderobe. Vents comfort today still leans on experiments from yesterday. So no, medieval tricks didn't die. They evolved, adapted, and hid in plain sight. Every time you look up at a skyline, drive across a bridge, or feel warm air from a vent, you're brushing shoulders with the ingenuity of masons who lived 8 centuries ago. Here's your punchline. The next time someone says medieval people were backward, just point to the nearest skyscraper and say, "Nice Gothic arch, bro." And now, as the last stones of our journey settle, the pace softens. You lean back, the weight of the night easing over you, the hum of history still echoing faintly in your mind. You, in every arch, every roofline, every quiet piece of design you take for granted. Breathe in slowly, as if you're inhaling the cool air drifting through the high windows of a Gothic nave. Breathe out gently, as though you're exhaling candlelight in a drafty hall. The world around you feels slower now, softer, more forgiving. Imagine yourself standing in a cathedral at dusk. The stained glass no longer blazes, it glows, faintly muted blues and reds slipping across stone floors. The air is still. The day's noise has fallen away, leaving you with only the quiet pulse of your own breath. You can almost hear the footsteps of masons who once walked here, their laughter, their arguments, their hope that what they built would outlast them, and it did. Things you build in your life, acts of care, words of kindness, even the simplest choices. Strength doesn't always come from size. Sometimes it comes from patience, from balance, from hidden geometry within your days. Now, as you drift further into stillness, let the arches of memory carry you upward, and the soft buttresses of rest hold you steady. You are safe, you are warm, and you are part of a story that stretches farther back than you can see, and farther forward than you can imagine. Sleep well, dream gently,